Hey, what's up? Thanks for listening. My name is Kevin Oberhausen. This is the Spiritual Millennial, episode number 001. Hey, what's up, and welcome to the Spiritual Millennial Podcast. My name is Kevin Oberhausen, and today we're going to talk all about the ego. I'm starting here with this episode because it's going to set the basis, the foundation for so much of what we talk about, but it's also something that everyone can relate to. If you've been incarnate here on planet Earth, you have experienced dealing with the ego. In fact, you may experience dealing with it on a daily basis. And it's in dealing with the ego that so many things that we would maybe call undesirable arise. Because the ego can have a tendency to really drift into illusion. Things like fear, like judgment, even anger. The anger itself, maybe not so much illusion, but the source of the anger being illusion. Oftentimes the source of anger can be judgment, taking things personal, because the ego likes to take things personally, even though nothing is ever personal. It's always about what's happening with them internally. Just like whenever you're getting upset or doing something, it's really what's happening within you internally. And where all of this can become even more of a struggle is when the ego starts to try to claim personal identity, or where you start to identify with the ego as your true self versus identifying with your true self, which is love, your I am presence, these different aspects of you. Your higher self is one way you can think of that term, I am presence. I am presence is a term that you'll hear me use a lot. It's the eighth dimensional aspect of yourself, but as a simple way to think about it, you can think of it as your higher self. And when I'm using certain terms like this, you hear me say something like, oh, it's the eighth dimensional aspect of you. You don't have to believe it. Please use discernment in every area of your life, whether it's listening to this podcast, reading or listening to the news, taking a yoga class, wherever, science books, magazines, etc. So this confusion between who you truly are and your ego is what can be referred to as the insane ego. And this is where the ego starts to, again, take place of the personal identity. And through this, so much confusion, pain, etc., can arise. And all of it really will often extend from this illusionary capacity, again, from judgment, fear, duality, things of that nature, illusion of separation, all of that stuff. So we're going to dive in and talk about how to distinguish your ego from yourself, how the ego speaks, the language of the ego, different tools, for that distinguishment, how this plays out in your life, how starting to transition and create this distinction and start to really develop that awareness of self, that awareness of your true self, of the heart, can play out in your life, the different ways that it can look like, but also what it leads to, the immense impact that it can have, and how it assists you in leading the loving, passionate life that you want, not just so that you're loving for other people and things like that, both so that you experience the loving nature that you want to experience within yourself and within the world, but it will also assist you in many other areas, including like finding and fulfilling your purpose. If you want to make money doing what you love, you have to follow your heart. You have to follow your heart, and you need to know the distinct differences between your heart and your ego, so that when your ego shows up, it's easy to recognize any illusionary capacities that are coming up, so you can knock them aside and move forward. So you're not feeling stuck by fear. So you're not feeling hurt by anger and judgment that you've placed on a situation. Remember, it's not about It's not ever about what the other person is doing. In fact, it is through this work with the ego that becomes very clear, so that it's not just a saying or like something that maybe intellectually get or just resonate with, but something that you really understand and experience. And that way, all this other shit that may happen around you just kind of blows by because you don't get caught up in it. All the pain and the stress and the etc., all of that shit comes from ego. Almost all of it, if not all of it. And so it's not just important, but very life-changing to do this sort of work and to really understand this thing and continue to learn and understand it, as this opens the doorways for growth and shifts in your world that are immense. If you want to tap into your abundance or find the love of your life or any of those things, understanding this ego stuff is one of the quickest ways to get there, because it really helps you to follow your heart in the fastest way to any destination that you really want to go is by following your heart. Hands down, guaranteed every single fucking time. Not only the fastest way, but the easiest way. The easiest way. And the only times it may not seem easy, that following your heart is not the easiest way, is when ego gets involved. So again, an important reason to know it, to understand it, and to love it. And that'll be another thing that we dive into, is loving the ego, because there can be this rhetoric out there about how, like starve the ego, feed the soul, like, down with the ego, or, fuck the ego, get rid of the ego, death to the ego. Sometimes it's not that extreme, but I've seen it in all different cases, but there's definitely this almost combative nature against the ego. And you don't want to do that for a couple of reasons. One, you have an ego. This ego is part of your composition while here incarnate on planet Earth. If you say, fuck your ego, or if you say, starve the ego, that's starving a part of yourself. And on top of that, to even say something of that nature, you've got to be an ego to do it. Because that's an us versus them mentality. And that us versus them mentality comes from ego itself. But we'll dive into that a little bit more in a bit. And diving into the meat of this episode, the first thing really to distinguish all of it, there's been an immense starting place within my own journey with really diving into this, is understanding that you have an ego, you are not your ego. That may sound like a simple distinction, something that's kind of like, well, of course I have an ego, I'm not my ego. But that is so key in understanding everything I'm about to share moving forward, and in working with your ego moving forward, and continuing to create this distinction and using this as a means of self-empowerment. You have an ego, you are not your ego. This kind of understanding can lead to things like when you hear or experience some sort of negative self-talk or negative response to yourself, it's easy to recognize. You can create that distinction. That's my ego. That's not me. I don't have to listen to that. That's not true, right? The ego has these illusory capacities. Your true self, coming from the heart and love, would never say these things. It's always loving words. Love without conditions. So it's always loving words. It doesn't matter what situation you're in, what you feel you have done, all this stuff. I mean, that guilt and that judgment and whatever, that comes from ego. So you're always going to get words of love and non-judgment, compassion, the energy of forgiveness, etc., from your true self. So when you hear these negative words come up, whether you're doing a practice with affirmations or it's within a certain life experience, you can quickly distinguish, hey, that's not my response. That's my ego's response. And that stuff's not true. And I don't have to listen to it. And I'm not going to. And then follow it up with all these loving statements about yourself coming from the heart and your true self. So it's a tool for empowerment, this distinction and this understanding. It also breeds to more understanding, which breeds compassion and things like that. So step one, you have an ego, you are not your ego. And that is an understanding that your ego will try to challenge or question or convince you otherwise of. Because the ego often needs to be in control. And that's where it starts to even try to take over with the identity in the first place. It needs to be in control. The ego needs to be in control. It feels the need to be right. Not always, right? You can align the ego with the heart. That's where a lot of this work comes into. But some of the things that these are some activities where you can know for sure this is from ego. The need to be right, judgment, fear, jealousy, anger, self-criticism, which probably falls into one of those few categories, being in control, as we just mentioned, views of duality, hate, and pretty much any sort of negatively charged thing, all products of ego, which are often products of some sort of illusory concept that the ego has bought into, or that has tried to tell you, and you've paid attention to it or have momentarily bought into it yourself. So oftentimes there'll be something, an action that occurs or happening that occurs, and your ego will have this response and start to maybe tell this story. And when you're able to clearly recognize those patterns and that ego behavior, when that happens, it's easier to just let it go. Still allow the ego to have that response, but let it go. When you let it go, it moves on, it clears, and then you come back to the heart, and you just allow the love to flow from your heart, and quote unquote right action. Let's not use the word right, and aligned action. When you have that action from the heart, this aligned action takes place instead. We aren't using the word right because right and wrong implies judgment, and we're moving out of that, or we're recognizing the illusionary aspects of that. And this, again, is product of ego. And so as you understand that this is the language of the ego, again, it's easier to distinguish when that's happening, which can be used as a tool of empowerment in the moment. So if you're in a situation and anger comes up, you can make the distinction. That's not my response, it's my ego's response. And then allow that response to occur and let it dissipate. And we'll dive more into that in a moment. If anger comes up, same thing. Judgment comes up, same thing. You can even, or even asking yourself, what does this look like without the judgment? What does this look like if there's no right or wrong? And I have a story about that too. But then the same with the negative messaging and all of that, being able to create that distinction in that moment allows you to have the room to not only let that go, but you're coming back to the heart, and it just gives you the room to react in a different way, and react in a way that isn't driven by these things, because action driven by these things just can lead to more of the same. Acting out of anger often can lead to more anger or hurt or pain. Acting out of illusion can often lead to to other illusionary things like hurt or pain. It's reminding me of the line from the Tool song Lateralus, all of this pain is an illusion. And we'll end up diving into some of that very directly. And continuing on that thought, acting out of scarcity will lead to more scarcity. Acting out of hate can lead to more hate. It's like the Martin Luther King Jr. quote. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And so when you want these specific things in your life, whether that's doing what you love for a living or experiencing a loving world, you have to have action aligned with that. And here we're back to that aligned action. That aligned action is aligned with the heart. True alignment is alignment with the heart. Alignment with love, which is alignment with all things, because love is the essence within all of it. And that aligned action comes from the heart, not from the ego. And again, you have an ego. You are not your ego. So recognizing this distinction, again, you can start to see more and more, provides the opportunity to step into your power and empower yourself to respond in this different way and come from that heart-based place. Now, again, this isn't to demonize the ego. And we started talking about this a little bit before. The ego isn't here to fuck up your life. It's not. Actually, the ego its base function is to serve you and provide protection. That's really its goal. Your ego on the base level, what some people can call the true ego, is really that fight-flight response, that fight-flight-freeze response. Because that fight or flight response made sure your ass didn't get eaten by a lion walking around in the jungle. Lion pops out, boom, the fear kicks in, activates those adrenals. You run 20 times faster than you ever have in your life and jump 20 feet in the air up into a tree, and you don't get eaten. Perfect. Thanks, ego. But as our living has kind of evolved a bit, and we're not sitting in the jungle, we're sitting in, beautiful apartments in Chicago recording podcasts. The ego and its function has gotten a little interesting. But even with this interesting function in a quote unquote more developed society, or let's say maybe a more intricate society, its base function is still self-preservation. It's still self-preservation. That's where that need to control comes from. That's where that anger comes from. A lot of times when people get angry, it's because, hold on, a lot of times the reason people's egos respond in anger, see, keeping that distinction, a lot of times when people's egos respond in anger, the anger is really sourced from taking something personally as a personal attack, and that anger is more so a defense response. Someone tries to take your muffin, you smack them. Maybe that's not a great example, but it's the stuff that leads to, in old days where someone steals, you chop off their hand. The sense of justice and right and wrong, one is ego based, but two, the idea is someone harms you, does something personal to you, you respond in a way that teaches them a lesson so that they won't continue to do it, and is a matter of defense. But as the saying goes, an eye for an eye and the whole world goes blind, right? So this isn't really aligned action. This isn't really action that brings us to the world we want to live in. That's why we don't chop people's hands off anymore. That's why some areas of the world no longer chop people's hands off if someone steals, right? But this all comes from, and it's easier to see with the anger, so we can maybe bring it back to the anger, or it could be easier to see with the anger, so we'll bring it back to anger. This comes from a taking things personally, which ultimately is, with the ego taking it personally, this reaction, it's all a means of self-preservation. It's all a means of self-preservation. Even the negative self-talk a lot of times can come from self-preservation. The negative self-talk coming from a fear of like failure, or a fear that if, something maybe goes too well, that bad things might happen, these other weird impressions that the ego can get, or it's stored stuff from your past. In fact, science and psychology claims that the mechanism that facilitates the storage of trauma is in part that fight, flight, freeze response, which is a physical manifestation of your ego. And the facilities by which we store trauma is actually a self-protection mechanism. Trauma occurs when you experience a moment of emotional or physical overwhelm. And when that happens, the millisecond before overwhelm, essentially, if we want to stick with a psychology-based language type model, a piece of you dissociates, goes into trance, and that trance state is stored so that so that you can come back to it later and handle it. Another way to think of it is just before that moment of total overwhelm, your consciousness takes a snapshot of the scene, freezes it, and stores it in the body, kind of separating that off, or kind of like, oop, too much right now. Let's put this here for later, so you can cope and move on. The adrenaline kicks in, or whatever is called for in the situation, and then later on it can be addressed and processed and removed. It is a self-protection mechanism facilitated by that fight, flight, freeze response of the ego. In fact, those stored states are referred to as ego states. And oftentimes when people hear that negative voice coming up, it's, they say the voice of their mother. My mother always used to say, or, was some crappy teacher, or, crappy was maybe a little judgmental there, but some teacher that said some things that didn't feel so lovely, and are coming up from these unprocessed ego states, which aren't meant to be negative. In fact, they were there, created initially as a means of self-protection. And when they're coming back up, it's actually an opportunity. It's showing you what's there to clear and get rid of that you're holding on to. Like, hey, we stored this earlier, remember? Let's move this out because we don't want to hold on to this here. And so again, it's just all a means of self-preservation. And no matter what the scenario that we look at, it would always boil down to, I would be willing to bet that it always boils down to some form of self-preservation. And so the ego here is not the enemy. The ego here is not something that is here again to just fuck up your life. The ego is there as a means of self-preservation. It can just sometimes maybe get a little confused or a little hurt or just a little freaked out, right? That's where all the fear is all product of ego. And it's all false energy appearing real. That's what it stands for. False energy appearing real, or fuck everything and run. It's a choice. The ego kind of freaks out in the it's like fuck everything and run, which is great if a lion's there, right? Like fuck everything and run. But in the rest of your life, false energy appearing real and recognizing that it's an illusionary thing. But again, this is all in a means of self-protection, and this is worth mentioning because there can sometimes, as I mentioned before, be this response of like, fuck the ego, or this ego viewed as this quote unquote bad thing. But again, the fuck the ego is an us versus them mentality, a duality mentality, which is illusion in itself. We're all one, first of all. So the us versus them thing it's like you versus yourself, which like that doesn't make sense. So fuck that. And then if you're viewing the ego as this bad thing, it's ego again, because that's judgment. That good and bad, that's judgment, which is illusion. Everything is love. Everything is love. So then you're still in ego. And then on top of that, again, you having an ego incarnate here on planet Earth, then you're saying that a part of you is bad, and kind of saying that a part of you is bad no matter what. That's going to create quite a struggle when it comes to self-love and when it comes to loving yourself completely. And that's where some of the challenge with that kind of anti-ego mentality comes in is one, you're an ego to even do that, but then two, you're reducing your level or potential level of happiness. You're keeping yourself from experience full happiness. So I used to do this. It used to be, I can only be, and this is something that I still have to remind myself of, and that I can catch myself doing, and even going into and catch my ego going into fear around. And that's, it's like I can only be this happy. I can only be this happy because if I get a little bit more happy than this, like it might go to the head, and that would be bad. Might go to my head, and that would be bad. Don't want to get, conceited or anything like that. And this, in some ways, would say, I'm sure, was of service to me and along my path. But I also see now how doing that was a way of saying, I can only be this happy, but not all the way happy. Because again, incarnate here, I have an ego, and this is part of my composition for now. And while incarnate here, or at least at this point while incarnate here, and to say that the ego cannot be happy is kind of to say that a part of you can't be happy, which means not all of you can be happy, which means you can't be completely happy. And that just doesn't make sense to do to yourself. And then on top of that, with the ego being viewed or judged as a bad thing by itself, by the ego, then loving it and loving yourself fully and completely and without conditions becomes a challenge, if at all possible. And that sounds like a shitty outcome too. I only get to love myself this much. Not all of me gets to be loved ever by anybody. Or not so much that it doesn't get to be loved, that you don't get to be loved completely by anybody, because your ability to love yourself does not determine other people's ability to love you. The whole thing, like, you can't be loved until you love yourself, is fucking bullshit. The capacity at which you love yourself does not determine my capacity to love you. It's determine God's capacity, the universe's capacity, source's capacity, however you want to name it. The, creator's capacity to love you, your mother's capacity to love you, your friend's capacity to love you is not dependent on your willingness to love yourself and then the judgments that you have on yourself. But the love that you allow yourself to experience and be aware of and to accept or receive maybe is determined by that level of love for yourself. People who have a hard time taking a compliment, if that's you, or if that's you, it's coming from a place of like, oh, well, I'm only so great. If you loved yourself completely, wholly, and fully, like someone complimenting you, you'd feel that throughout your body. You'd be like, fuck yeah, I am. Then probably respond with, and you are too. Throwing it right back, just cycling it right through because you've just got love completely and fully and wholly without conditions flowing in and out at this amazingly allowing rate. But as you hold that judgment against your ego, that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. And I had a conversation recently where I feel this person would maybe respond with, oh, well, you can still view your ego as bad and say, well, even though you're bad, I love you. But that's still illusion. That's still illusion, because then you're missing it's through that illusion there, that judgment, like, oh, well, no, it's bad, but I love you anyway. That's where you miss that whole thing, that the ego is there with self-preservation. The whole reason it's there is self-preservation. You'll miss that with holding that judgment and staying in that illusion. Also, it is your ego that would have made that determination, not your true self. Your heart would never have said that. Your heart goes, no, this is here in self-preservation. It just can struggle a bit. And so like, it's up to you if you want to dive into that struggle, if you want to, love it and help diffuse that struggle, right? Your ego, it's almost like, it can almost be like taking care of a scared or upset child when referring to your ego. But your ego isn't this bad thing. One, that's an illusionary statement. Two, it's there for self-preservation. Why would you ever call something that is truly there for self-preservation a bad thing? Now, then you can maybe say, oh, but Kevin, like the things that it does are bad though. No, the vehicles, if again, we remove the judgment from it, the vehicles upon which it tries to do this self-preservation thing may be a little confused or undesirable. Again, that aligned action doesn't happen as much. And we can maybe say that happens because it boils down, again, action not so much coming fully from the heart, uninhabited from the heart, but kind of filtered and confused through the ego. But true love, this love without conditions, never judges, never views anything as bad. It's not, oh, you're bad. You're bad, but I love you anyways. It's, oh, you're an amazing part of this divine, loving, magnificent existence. And I love you, and I love you, and I love you. And it's not, I love you because you are this divine magnificence. It's just that through the eyes of love, you're able to see that no matter what. But love just loves because it's love. That's it. And another reason I say that it's not, oh, you're bad and I love you anyways, and that illusion or that judgment being illusionary, is that again, that good and bad, that's duality, creates separation, and it's all one. It's all one. And it's all love. So again, having this thing against the ego is not only of the ego, but counterproductive. And that's where, again, realizing this, that I was kind of limiting, like, oh, well, I can only be this happy, or I can only love this, or only this much of me can be loved or not judged or whatever. That very clearly realized, like, no, like, let your ego be happy. Why wouldn't you let your ego be happy? Why wouldn't you do that? One, that's controlling, which is, again, from the ego. Like all the reasons you wouldn't do that, all based in ego. The ego seems to be the only thing that would act contradictory to itself. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean to do that. There's like a self-preservation thing. And this ego has a capacity, seems to maybe have this capacity to split. Again, that's kind of where the trauma processing occurs, right? Like a piece of you dissociate, goes into trance, stored. And that's a self-protection mechanism. So the ego is an interesting thing. I'm not going to dive down the rest of that route too far. But coming back to it, now that we've made sure that don't fall into the trap of demonizing the ego, one more comment on that, actually. The way you stay humble while allowing your ego to be happy is by staying, again, focused on your heart and in love. If you are always focused in love, grounded in your heart, grounded in love, You don't have to worry about being conceited or arrogant or any of that, which is all ego stuff. That's all ego stuff. So if you're remaining in the heart, it doesn't matter. That's not going to happen. So it's not don't let your ego be happy. It's remain focused in the love. Remain focused in the love. Remain focused in the love. And there's different ways to do that, some of which we'll talk about now. So I like to share a lot of things through story because I feel like story really helps exemplify certain ideas. And so a lot of this stuff happened for me after a workshop. And it was within this workshop. It was a workshop with a friend of mine named John Armitage. He's the founder of that. He's the founder of a program called New Paradigm MDT. MDT stands for Multidimensional Transformation. Amazing workshops. I highly recommend them to anyone. But within this workshop, John ends up mentioning at this one point, you are not your ego, or you have an ego, you are not your ego. And then went on to talk about the language of the ego, like we have so far: anger, fear, hatred, judgment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I really took it to heart and took off running with it. And so moving forward, every time I felt fear, anger, I would make the distinction. This is not my response. This is my ego's response. And something very interesting would happen when I would do that. And that anger or that fear that that my ego was responding with, that I was aware of. So the way we would often say that is this anger that I was feeling, but that's not true. It's your ego was responding in anger and you were aware of it because you have an energetic sense that allows you to be aware of emotions. And so when I would make this distinction, all of a sudden there was this detachment from the emotion. So it went from feeling really, really caught up in the emotion and very attached to it, almost, again, like as if it were mine. And then when I created the distinction, this is not my response, but this is my ego's response, all of a sudden there's this detachment. And the way that kind of felt was as if I was still very aware of the sensation, but it was more like I was aware of it in my body, or just aware of the sensation of it, but not so attached to it. So created this distinction, this detachment that allowed me more opportunity to kind of move around and respond. And so when I made this distinction and felt this shift, the next step I took, and so some of this, as a side note, developed over time, responding in this way over and over, and the process kind of expanded itself until it led into some of the experiences I'm about to share. But it created this distinction. And then the next step was to just allow it to dissipate. Take a deep breath and just allow it to dissipate. Actually, you could even take the deep breath before you make the distinction. And here's the significance of that. The breath itself takes you back to the heart, helps bring your awareness back to the heart, brings you back to the heart. And when you bring yourself back to the heart, have your awareness come back to the heart, moves out of the ego and into the heart. So already it's helping you there. Then you create this distinction, and that distinction, determining, defining, affirming that distinction of you have an ego, but you are not your ego. Just like, you have a body, but you're not your body, or you have a hand, but you're not your hand. Then allows you, it's even to, again, bringing you back to the heart, I would say, because you're kind of like coming out of that, caught up in that ego thing. And you're then just sitting with that awareness of it. And then as you move to allow that to dissipate, not shove the anger down. We're going to focus on anger for a bit with this because there were slightly different experiences with anger and fear. And then I'm going to tell a story about judgment. If you shove that anger down or push that anger to the side, you're going into struggle, which is more of an ego thing, very resistant, and from that, not only is there going to be kickback, but as you're going into ego, which is maybe why there's the kickback, one, the ego may just kick back, but two, you're going into ego, which is bringing you back into that struggle and fighting and all the ego-based things anyways. And you could end up even angrier or confused or just, whatever, in a state that you don't want to be in, that you don't desire to be in. And then you're kind of back to square one. But when you just allow for that anger to dissipate, a couple of things happen. One, with the allowance, you go to your heart. Love allows. We may dive into why I say that, why I share that quality of love so much, if not in this episode, sometime soon. But when you go into a mode of allowance, it's again just it's moving into your heart even further. Love allows. You're also then moving out of struggle or not engaging in struggle. And as you move into that allowance and move deeper into the heart, you find that anger vanishes so fast, sometimes almost instantly. Other times, maybe it takes a moment or two. But it's just taking another deep breath, which again brings you to the heart, moving to that mode of allowance, just allowing that feeling to dissipate, right? So it's like, it's almost validating the ego. On a subconscious level, you can maybe picture the conversation as like, oh, hi, ego. Like, I see that you're upset. That's okay. I'm just going to allow you to be upset. I'm just going to sit here in love and allow you to be upset. And the ego goes, oh, okay, I'm done. And that stuff goes away. And boom, you've gone from this anger to back in the heart and feeling clear. And now whatever action you take next is going to be much more aligned, have a much higher chance of being aligned than if you acted from that anger. Because if you're acting from the anger, it's not an aligned action. Again, anger just can create more anger or more pain or other things that come from illusion, whereas acting from the heart is going to lead you to more things of love and peace and prosperity, abundance, etc. All these things that are inherent to the natural essence of creation, inherent to the natural essence of everything, of the universe, of source. But the step that then developed after that, when I found myself in this place, I would consciously make the decision or affirmation or command and now allow the love to flow, or I allow love to flow, to this person, and would even maybe envision like just allowing love to flow freely and immensely and at whatever rate or intensity was just appropriate for that time. Again, just by allowing it, not trying to figure it out or decide it, just allowing the love to flow to this other person, which again, just more pulling you into the heart. And it's kind of a practice of responding to every situation with love. So responding with love without conditions. It's always what you respond with in every situation. That's kind of the practice there. No matter what comes up, responding with love, with love, with love. And then after doing this a couple of times, making the distinction, allowing the response and the feeling to dissipate, and then having that conscious decision now allowed to love the flow, some interesting things happened. One, after doing this a few times at a point, allowing this to happen, all of a sudden I became very aware of what the other person was going through, or just had a very strong sense or this clarity around what was really happening. And so the way that I explain this is, as you come back to this point, as you come back to the heart and allow this love to flow, now you're seeing with eyes of love. And when you see through eyes of love, you see things as they really are, because love is the essence. And all of a sudden, I just had this recognition of the struggle that this person was going through. And a few things unfolded from this. First, I recognized that this person's actions had nothing to do with me. I recognized that it had everything to do with their own internal struggle, their own responses, their own ego stuff, their ego's responses, their ego's response, and nothing to do with me. And in that realization, a few things happened. One, I also realized that when my ego has these responses, it's got nothing to do with the other person. When there's these issues of anger and judgment and this and that, it has nothing to do with the other person, always yourself. And it's true the other way around. Always 100%. Saw this very clearly. So this ends up playing at some point into taking responsibility for yourself and plays into means of empowerment, but that will be a totally a different episode on its own. But recognizing this not only allowed me to see that it had nothing to do with me, which diffuses the taking it personally, which again diffuses even more of the anger if there was any left at this point anyways, because the anger is usually coming from taking it personally, and the ego loves to take things personally. So viewing this and experiencing this, the ego taking things personally, that just drops, right? That just drops. And in the future, should it ever have that response, it's very easy to recognize it and move past it and let it go. and do this practice that I'm sharing here. But then through recognizing the struggle, this compassion flows. And I don't remember again if this all happened in one setting or if this was like, the next occurrence where I did this. But the compassion flows because you recognize that struggle and you know that struggle. Even if it's not to the T, the same details of something that you've experienced or been through on a personal level yourself, you having an ego and having experienced ego issues, so to speak, recognize that struggle. And from that recognition and that understanding, compassion. The compassion just flows, almost as if involuntary, but really you're allowing it. So I wouldn't necessarily call it involuntary. You're in this mode of allowance and you just allow this to come through. But the compassion, it just roars. It just comes right out once this understanding hits. And from this experience, I often share that understanding breeds compassion if they're not one and the same. And so now you've gone from angry to calm to understanding to compassionate. And as you're and through all of these steps and all the things that you're doing, you're just sinking deeper and deeper and deeper into the heart. And then from that, the next moment, just love, pure love without conditions. And in that moment, through these processes, I'm going to say I changed, though really I think it's just a deeper awareness or experience with yourself. But the way I viewed things, the way I experience and interact with things certainly changed because there was this tangible, it was like reaching into or connecting with, experiencing this love, this essence of myself, of all of us. This essence is you and your parents and law enforcement and children and all these things, even though you might feel a little bit of a response when I say that, this love is everyone, is everything. And as I continued with this practice at that moment where then the compassion went uninhibited, and then through that, if not in that same moment, the very next, that love just flowed. And the experience, the way I just end up explaining it over and over is like things just shifted. Saw everything so much differently. And it's looking through these eyes of love and not through ego or illusion. And that really transforms something. And on top of that, through this whole practice, you've just continued to, it's just this practice of coming to the heart, instead of going to the ego. If the response before was anger, now the response is love. And unconditionally or without condition, the response is love. And this whole practice, the reason I say it's kind of meditative in nature is a base of this practice is allowing what comes up to come up, but not wrestling with it, not engaging with it, just allowing it to come up and go out, just allowing. And that allowance brings you to the heart because, again, love allows. And the reason I say that, instead I'd maybe tap and listen to a different episode, but the reason I say that love allows, if you envision source or God or the universe, whatever name you like to use, existing as this radiating love, just this essence of love without conditions, radiating and flowing eternally, infinitely throughout everything and anything, every piece and particle of existence and beyond, that love just radiates and radiates and radiates. And if you picture yourself maybe from the viewpoint of sources that's happening, and off in the distance, there's you, like a silhouette of you, just going about your life, doing different things. No matter what it is you do, this love that's radiating, this source that's just radiating, this love that's just radiating to you consistently, never endingly, no matter what, as you are going through your actions, no matter what you do, whether it's getting a glass of water or if you cheat on a test, it doesn't matter. The love never stops. Source never responds, just like up, and pauses like, ooh, you better put your eyes back on your own paper, buddy. Okay, cool. And then goes back to loving you. That never fucking happens. Source never tells you to stop, to turn around, tries to control what you do, ever, ever. It just loves continuously, consistently, no matter what, and just allows. It just allows. Whatever you do, it just allows. It just loves. And so that's why I say love allows. That I feel is an inherent quality of love. This love without conditions. And so now you've gone from angry at a family member or a coworker or whoever to loving this person without condition, feeling compassion for them, and their actions are no longer affecting you because you're not taking them personally, or your ego's not taking them personally. Or if there's a moment where your ego does, it's so much easier to just let that go, and boom, you find yourself right back in that state of love, or aware of that state of love. That love's always there. But you find yourself right back into that awareness of that state of love. And then this practice moves on over to fear as well, and looks very similar, but there's also a distinct outcome from the practice with fear that I'd really like to share with you as well. So with the fear, it starts similar way. The ego has a fear response. You create the distinction or define or affirm the distinction. This is not my response. This is my ego's response. But then recognize that the fear is an illusion. The fear is an illusion, false energy appearing real. One of the definitions that I really like to share is, fear is the illusion of the absence of love. And this experience that I'm about to share really, I think, exemplifies that. And so when you create this distinction, too, something to be aware of, when you create this distinction, this is not my response, but my ego's response. The ego might still sit there like, fuck everything and run, fuck everything and run, fuck everything and run. Because the ego's freaking out, but that's okay. You create that distinction and you allow that fear to dissipate. You allow the fear to dissipate. And through that, what you find on the other side when it dissipates is that all is well. Every single time on the other side of that fear, all is well. Like, fuck, everything's amazing. Every single time on the other side of that fear, it always came back to like this very present sense of security and safety and this like tangible quality of this movement of this love and this almost like tangible visibility of the fact that there's this essence at play and moving throughout all of existence in your life that is working for your highest good always. And every time that fear dissipated, they came back to that same sense that all is well, a very tangible way. And so after this happens enough times, you start to, your response to all this really starts to shift because you really start to understand and experience, feel that, well, shit, all is well. It's all good. Every single time I just let the fear go, it's like, wow, everything's fucking all right. And so this practice with the fear just leads to, again, seeing the illusionary aspect of it all, but then changing the relationship with it. It can become easier and easier to let it go and to just recognize. And sometimes the ego will fight for dear life to convince you otherwise. But truly, it's all is well. And you see that every single time when you don't jump in and buy into the ego's response to whatever the fear is trying to tell you. In reality, all is well. And the last part of all this I want to share is a story about judgment. There was a point where I was facilitating at a location where there was another facilitator that I thought was going about things in the wrong way. And it was when I was fuming about it one day that I caught myself saying that. The thought was they're even going about this the wrong way. And when I heard the wrong way part, I was like, okay, well, wrong, right and wrong, that's judgment. So let's take a look at what it looks like when the judgment is pulled out of it. How can I say this if the judgment isn't there? So it's not that they're doing it the wrong way. It's not that they're doing it in the right way. It's that they're doing it their way. And their way, and the people that are interacting with this way, this is what's in the highest and best service for them at this time. So everything's happening for our highest good. And on top of that, if it's in the highest and best for them, it's in the highest and best for me, because we're all one. So something can't be in the highest good for one person and not in the highest good for another. Except separation. We're all one. We're all one. There's only one existence, one love, and one highest good. And with that recognition and really seeing it, instead of seeing it as a wrong way and seeing it as his way, and that this way is just as what's in service for everyone, regardless if I see exactly why that is at the time. And later on, I was able to see very clearly, where some of it played out so well for me, because it ended up leading me to finding a situation I was very happy with as a facilitator, as well as this leading to me having this experience and being able to share this, which is played out well for many reasons, not just this podcast, but because of the workshops and other things that I share. But once I removed the judgment from it, all of a sudden, the anger was gone. All of a sudden, all of the anger I felt around the situation was gone. And I realized in that moment that the anger my ego was experiencing, the anger, I almost said the anger I was feeling, but the anger, the angry response that my ego was having that I was aware of, if we want to, as we get distinct, that anger wasn't caused by what the other person was doing, because the anger went away as soon as the judgment went away. What the person was doing didn't change at all. What changed was that I removed removed the judgment from the situation, got rid of the judgment I had on the situation. And from that, the anger went. So the source of the anger was actually the judgment itself. Again, showing that these responses are based in an illusory nature. The judgment, an illusory thing, because again, it buys into duality, which is we're all one. Everything is one. So duality and separation isn't really there. There is no, right or wrong, good or bad. But then the anger was gone, and the anger was there from taking it personally, and it just wasn't personal. 2, the anger coming from blaming someone else for doing something that was, again, based in judgment. Like it all wraps into, I feel like I might end up talking myself in circles. So I'm just going to make it a clear cut ending with this. It all came down to the judgment and the illusionary aspects of my ego's response that led to the anger in the first place. And once the judgment was removed, the anger was gone. It never had anything to do with the other person. All had to do with the judgment coming from my ego and buying into that. And so through that, we can see in a tangible way, not only how these things can work, but practices to reach some of these points or create some of these shifts ourselves. That practice, and those practices boiling down to, I'll give like 2 distinct ones. The first is when that anger, fear, negative response, negative self-talk, whatever comes up, making that distinction. This is not my response. This is my ego's response. Then step 2, allowing that response or the feeling that came with that response to dissipate, not fighting it, not going into struggle. That's kicking things back into ego, just allowing it, taking a deep breath and allowing it. And can even reinforce, like, especially if it's negative self-talk, you can then start reinforce with positive affirmations or positive thoughts. And so from the deep breath and the allowance and that distinction helps create that awareness, bringing that awareness of your ego versus trying to experience things as your ego. That awareness of the ego, allowing that to dissipate, that allowance and the deep breath with it, bringing you back to the heart. And then when you come back to the heart, making that distinct decision, like allow the love to flow. Our hearts are always open. It's just a matter of allowance. So just allowing the love to flow. Nobody's hearts are closed. It's just the love's always there. It's just allowing the love to flow. And then from allowing the love to flow, this practice over and over, it starts leading to all these different things on such a tangible level. Same thing with the fear. Distinction, allowing the feeling to dissipate. Love. And then with the judgment, a practice that has really helped me out is start paying attention to comparison words. Start paying attention to comparison words. Anytime you use, right, wrong, good, bad, etc. Now, not all comparison words are coming from a place of judgment. I don't even think right and wrong are always used in a place of judgment. It could just be, you could mean like accurate or inaccurate, or correct or incorrect. So a lot of times in this podcast, you'll hear me use those words, accurate or inaccurate, correct or incorrect. And that's because I'm looking to, and even correct or incorrect, I'm kind of like phasing out, I think. But this is just to be more definitive in what I mean, because I'm not saying something is right versus wrong, and like especially like a moral sense or ethical sense or things like that, or, implying certain like wrongness of being, those sorts of things. So not all comparative words are necessarily inherently judgmental, or means that you're coming from a place of judgment, but by paying attention to every to every comparison word that you make. And then when you notice yourself using a comparative word, ask yourself, well, how can I say this without using a comparison word? And when you reframe the sentence or recreate the sentence without using a comparative word, if there was judgment in it originally and you remove that judgment, you will feel the difference. And then other times you'll just recognize like, no, this wasn't coming from a place of judgment. And as you do this over and over, you just start to get clearer and clearer on when you're doing it, how you're doing it, what it feels like when you're doing it. And then you can decisively choose to act differently or not buy into that, again, recognizing it more and more, like this is your ego's response, and just kind of learning more and more how that works. And the more and more you learn to understand about how the ego works, the more and more in depth this goes. And the more and more it's easier to navigate, and the more you learn and understand about yourself, and the more you experience yourself in the true nature of it. When you hit that point where you go from anger to this overwhelming flow and awareness of love without conditions flowing to this person, and your awareness of your immense unconditional love, of your immense love for this person, it's changing. You're experiencing your true nature. It's transformative. And so this is how you can navigate that, creating the distinction, allowing the ego to have that response, allowing that feeling to dissipate, and then responding with love, choosing to allow that love to flow. And continuing to recognize that you have an ego, you're not your ego, and recognizing the language of the ego that we spoke about at the start of the episode. I had a lot of fun recording this. I hope you enjoyed it as well, listening to it. And I would love to keep the conversation open on this. So if you go to kevinoberhausen.com/loveyourego, it'll take you to the show notes for this episode where the discussion can continue, the comment section, or you can always find me on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I read as many comments as I can. This is the stuff that I really love to talk about and feel passionate about engaging in. So be sure to head there if you have any questions, comments, if you agree, disagree. And if you enjoy this episode and you know of other people who you think will enjoy it and resonate with it as well, please share it across your different networks. Thank you so much for listening. Again, my name is Kevin. You're listening to the Spiritual Millennial Podcast, and I will see you in another episode.